Britain does owe reparation. At the end of May 2015, the Oxford Union held a debate on the motion this House believes Britain owes reparations to her former colonies. Speakers included Shashi Tharoor and John Mackenzie. The British historian Tharoor's argument in support of the motion has found favour among many Indians, where the subject of colonial exploitation has remained a sore topic. Professor Mackenzie, a well-known historian, spoke against the motion. As the seventh speaker out of 8, he feels like Henry VIII's last wife. First, he would like to comment on Sir Richard Otway, British Conservative politician, remarks that it could be argued that the economic situation of the colonies was actually worsened by the experience of British colonialism. With reference to India, he comments that India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4% because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's industrial revolution was actually premised upon the industrialization of India. Britain came right in, smashed handloom weavers' thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw material from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer, went from having 27% of the world trade to less than 2%. By the end of 19th century, the fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression. Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines. The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal famines during the Second World War, when 4 million people died. The British were trying to do their colonial enterprise out of enlightened despotism, to try and bring the benefits of colonialism and civilization to the benighted. As others have said on the proposition, violence and racism were the reality of the colonial experience. With reference to World War I, Shashi Tharoor remarks that 1/6 of all the British forces that fought in the war were Indian. 54,000 Indians actually lost their lives in that war. 65,000 were wounded and another 4,000 remained missing or in prison. Indian taxpayers had to cough up £100 million in that time's money. To World War, it was even worse. 2.5 million Indians in uniform. He won't believe it to the point, but out of Britain's total war debt of £3 billion in 1945 money, £1.25 billion was owed to India and never actually paid. Scots had actually tried to send colonies out before 1707. The Jamaican High Commissioner has pointed out, our railways and roads were really built to serve British interests and not those of the local people. But he might add that many countries have built railways and roads without having had to be colonized in order to do so. They were designed to carry raw materials from the hinterland into the ports to be shipped to Britain. And the fact is that the Indian or Jamaican or other colonial public, their needs were incidental. Transportation, there was no attempt made to match supply to demand for mass transport, none whatsoever. Britain made all the profits, controlled the technology, supplied all the equipment, and absolutely all these benefits came as private enterprise, British private enterprise at Indian public risk. That was the railways as an accomplishment. The British aid to India is about 0.4% of India's GDP. The government of India actually spends more on fertilizer subsidies, which might be an appropriate metaphor for that argument. It's been pointed out that, for example, dehumanization of Africans in the Caribbean, the massive psychological damage that has been done, the undermining of social traditions, of property rights, of the authority structures of these societies, all in the interest of British colonialism. And the fact remains that many of today's problems in these countries, including the persistence and, in some cases, the creation of racial and ethnic and religious tensions, were the direct result of colonial experience. So there is a moral debt that needs to be paid. There are other examples. There is Italy's reparations to Libya, there is Japan's to Korea, even Britain has paid reparations to the New Zealand Maoris 12. So it is not as if this is something unprecedented or unheard of that's going to somehow open some sort of nasty Pandora's box. There is a wonderful expression in Texas that summarizes the arguments of the opposition: all hats and no cattle. At the end, he says that ability to acknowledge a wrong that has been done, to simply say sorry, will go a far longer way than some percentage of GDP in the form of aid. It's required to accept the principle that reparations are owed. Further, he remarks that he will be happy if it was £1 a year for the next 200 years after the last 200 years of Britain in India.